You can follow this story by reading the subtitles, or you can leave the audio playing while you do other things, or even to help you sleep. Katy's coffin suddenly started shaking during her funeral. The officiating priest screamed, "God, no!" When the coffin was opened, what happened next was unbelievable. David dejectedly stood at the front pew of the old Gothic-style church as some gloomy-looking men, all dressed in black suits, wheeled the coffin into the church. It was his beloved wife Katy's funeral service, and he had vowed not to break down in tears, but the depressing requiem sung by the choir did not help one bit. David's eyes were as red as hot coals as he had been crying inconsolably since the news of Katy's death hit him like a missile the day earlier. Hence, there were basically no tears left in him. Yet, as he stood there in the midst of a sea of relatives, friends, and well-wishers and watched the undertakers, David just couldn't help but wipe his eyes with his folded white handkerchief. The four men gently placed the coffin down on the raised white platform in front of the altar. The men in black then dispersed at once like the trained undertakers they were, and it was then time for the priest to bless the coffin. The officiating priest, Father Daman, bowed before the altar as he made his way to the coffin, carrying a burning incense with him. Father Daman was standing in front of the coffin, spreading the incense all around and blessing the corpse when it happened. The coffin suddenly started shaking, or so it seemed to the priest at first. The priest thought that his old tired eyes were playing some sort of trick on him, so with the incense seemingly frozen in the air in his left hand, Father Daman wiped his eyes with his right palm before he took a long, hard look at the coffin. It was still shaking ever so slightly. "My God, what is happening?" Father Daman, looking like someone who had just seen a ghost, screamed in utter disbelief while crossing and recrossing himself. David was the first person to rush to the priest. Father Daman, who was still looking quite stunned and shivering with fear, just pointed at the shaking coffin. David glanced at the coffin, and to his utter astonishment, it was indeed slightly shaking. David let out a loud scream and collapsed on the floor. The whole church was thrown into pandemonium. Some guests were rushing to the shaking coffin, while others rushed to a collapsed David. Everyone just seemed to be running helter-skelter. A crowd immediately gathered around the priest and coffin. Everyone just stood there staring at the still shaking coffin in sheer bewilderment. There were loud screams, cries, and murmurings of disbelief. It was total chaos, just like in the movies. Soon, a man in the crowd came rushing to the fainted David with a bottle of chilled water. The man emptied the bottle of water on David's face, while some others tried other measures to revive him. The chilled water made an immediate impact on David as he slowly opened his eyes and started coughing. Murmurs of joy went through the crowds gathered around David at once. Meanwhile, Katy's only sister Veronica, who was among the first people to rise to her sister's coffin, had been passionately and desperately pleading with Father Daman to open the coffin. In the time it took David to come to, the priest, who was finally ready to oblige Veronica's request, did open the coffin, but not after crossing himself 3 times. "Oh God, no!" was Father Damon's cry when he finally opened the coffin's lid, and he and the entire gathered crowd were treated to their worst nightmare. Katy was a 31-year-old woman. She had lost her parents in a ghastly murder accident while she was 19 years old and already in college. It was Katy's elder sister, Veronica, who was 6 years older than her and already working in a bank, that saw her through college. The sisters maintained an unbreakable bond between them. Katy was lucky enough to secure a modest-paying job at a political consultancy and lobbying firm almost immediately upon her graduation from college, and that was where she met her husband. The handsome David, who was a young aspiring politician, had visited the firm on behalf of his boss Johnson, the city's mayor. It was love at first sight between the then 24-year-old Katy and 29-year-old David. Over time, the duo were fully dating, and their romance kept blossoming. Katy wasn't particularly beautiful. She was best described as plain-looking, but she was so nice, humble, and kind. In fact, Katy was such a sweet soul. Needless to say, it was Katy's awesome personality that endeared her to David and not her looks. For Katy, David was the perfect man. He was tall, handsome, and was quite ambitious and determined to make it big in the brutal world of politics. Soon enough, Katy moved in with David. Barely a year after they met, David proposed to Katy, and she gladly accepted the proposal. A few months later, the lovebirds had a simple and modest wedding. The marriage was really a blissful one. It was indeed a match made in heaven despite the fact that the couple remained childless. Katy and David tried everything possible to have a baby of their own. They went for countless fertility tests, all of which confirmed that there was nothing medically wrong with either of them fertility-wise. The couple consulted numerous fertility experts, most of whom placed them on special diets and fertility supplements, which the couple religiously adhered to, but all to no avail. At long last, David and Katy seemed to have finally accepted their fate of childlessness, and they basically kept waiting for their own time to have kids. However, the couple kept living in sheer peace and harmony. They appeared to be so much in love with each other. Katy and David were the perfect happy couple. At the time of the couple's first meeting, David worked as a senior personal assistant to the then incumbent mayor of the city, Mr. Johnson. The old mayor was quite loved by the city folk. He was widowed and childless too. As a senior PA, David was Mr. Johnson's right-hand man. He served the old mayor so dedicatedly that, with time, the relationship between the two grew beyond a professional one. Mr. Johnson basically started seeing David as the son he never had. The mayor couldn't go to any events without David by his side, nor could he take any major decisions without consulting his trusted and reliable personal assistant. The bonds between both men grew to the extent that Mr. Johnson started delegating some of his mayoral duties to David, who proved his political astuteness over and over again by the effective manner he handled such duties. Mr. Johnson was 75 and had been mayor of the city for the past 2 decades. He was increasingly ailing and frail. Hence, the old mayor wished to retire at the end of his term in office, which was to end in a year's time, for some much-needed rest. But the city folk were having none of that. Due to the sheer love they had for the mayor because of his immense contributions to the city's economic development and airtight security throughout his long term in office, the majority of the city's populace tried to persuade Mr. Johnson to run once again in the upcoming mayoral elections, an election which everyone knew was simply going to be a walkover for the popular mayor. But Mr. Johnson had already made up his mind to retire, so he politely declined the offer and instead promised his supporters that he would name a worthy successor who would carry on his good works from where he stopped. And who else did Mr. Johnson name as his successor if not his trusted political protege David? Hence, leading up to the elections, it was quite certain that David would easily beat his 2 main rivals to the position of mayor. It was almost like a foregone conclusion that he would win a landslide victory due to Mr. Johnson's endorsement. David was, of course, overjoyed when Mr. Johnson named him as his successor. It had always been his dream to follow in his political mentor's footsteps as the city's mayor. David obviously saw the position as a perfect springboard for his ambitious political dreams. Katy, on her part, was equally happy for her husband's growing popularity and achievements in his political career. She used her expertise and connections as a mayor's staff in the big political consultancy firm she worked at to great effect in helping his campaign. It was even Katy who formulated a resounding manifesto for David's campaign. She surely did contribute her part to her beloved husband's mayoral bid. But tragedy struck barely 2 weeks to the eagerly anticipated election. Katy collapsed in her office less than 2 hours after she had arrived for work that morning. Katy's colleagues rushed her to the hospital, where she was pronounced dead on arrival. David was overwhelmed with sorrow when the sad news of his beloved wife's death reached him. He was in the midst of a meeting with his campaign staff and volunteers when the hospital called to inform him of Katy's demise. The telephone fell out of David's hand out of shock, and he then promptly burst into tears and cried uncontrollably like a baby. It took the combined efforts of some of David's closest aides and campaign volunteers to calm him down. David gave a very emotional live press release later that evening after he had been to the hospital and seen Katy's remains. The press release was widely covered by local journalists and aired by local news channels. While speaking in the press release, David, who was flanked by a legion of aides and supporters alike, firmly accused his political enemies of being behind his wife's shocking death. According to David's claims, his political enemies had somehow managed to poison Katy with some sort of slow-acting poison as she took the train to her workplace that morning. David was certain that his political enemies killed his wife to scare him away from running in the upcoming election. Then, to loud cheers of support, David concluded the press release by vowing to bury Katy according to her personal wishes the following day, after which he would duly move on with his campaign despite the tragic circumstances. That's what Katy would have wanted. Despite the cheering crowd behind him, David just couldn't help but burst into tears at the tail end of his speech. His closest aides rushed to console him at once, and they led David away from the podium. It was quite an enormous press release, to say the least. David stuck to his vow to bury Katy the day following her death. With the help of his aides and enough funds at his disposal, David was able to arrange everything for the funeral and burial in such a short time span. It was during the funeral service that Father Daman noticed that Katy's coffin was shaking. David had recovered from his fainting spell and was being supported to stand on his feet when Father Daman opened Katy's coffin after Veronica had desperately pleaded with him to do so. As the priest finally opened the coffin's lid, everyone surrounding the coffin was horrified. Lying inside the coffin, Katy was breathing ever so slightly, her eyes still closed, and her legs subconsciously kicking around, which was the reason for the coffin's shaking. All hell broke loose inside the church once the coffin was opened. Some people among the crowd ran away from the coffin in utter horror, others screamed and made a cacophony of shocking noises. As for Father Daman, he still stood in front of the opened coffin, paralyzed with shock, while still crossing and recrossing himself. When David got closer to the coffin, he glanced into it and immediately burst into tears, which sounded like a mixture of tears of joy and sorrow. "My beloved Katy, I knew you would surely come back to me, my love," David kept screaming amid heavy tears. It was only Veronica who seemed to know the right thing to do at that most horrifying scene. The moment she had recovered from her initial shock after seeing Katy breathing slightly, Veronica ran out of the noisy church. Once outside, she brought out her phone and, with shaking hands, dialed the emergency line. As soon as the emergency staff came on the line, Veronica breathlessly told them of the situation and gave them the church's address. Barely 10 minutes later, the loud sirens of the ambulance were heard blazing outside the church. The emergency personnel were soon seen rushing into the church with a stretcher. Inside the church, which was still in total chaos, the emergency workers made straight for the coffin. They then lifted Katy onto the stretcher and rushed her to the ambulance outside. Veronica jumped into the ambulance before it sped off to the nearest hospital. David, with some of his closest aides, followed the ambulance in his SUV. At the hospital, Katy was promptly rushed to the intensive care unit, where a team of doctors worked for almost 3 hours to revive her. After the doctors had successfully revived Katy, the chief doctor walked into the waiting room where David, Veronica, and others were all nervously but hopefully waiting for the news of her revival. The doctor announced their success at fully reviving Katy to the general joy of all those in the room. The doctor then turned to David, who had been fervently pacing up and down the room before the doctor's arrival, and informed him that he wished to have a word with him in his office. Once there, the doctor ushered David into the cozy chair in front of his desk. He then cleared his throat before revealing to David that traces of poison had been found in Katy's system. "I said it, didn't I?" David quickly blurted out at the mention of the word poison. "My political enemies poisoned my beloved Katy just to scare me away from running in the elections. But God has foiled their plans, and my love survived," David finished with a smile. The doctor completely ignored David's antics and resumed his revelations. According to the doctor, the poison was a slow-acting one, and the effects would take as much as 2 hours to kick in. But fortunately for Katy, and unfortunately for the person or people who attempted to poison her, the poison had expired. Hence, even though it was still potent enough to knock Katy off into a coma, The poison's effects were already starting to wear off when Katy started kicking around inside the coffin. David left the doctor's office looking really downcast. It was a case of attempted murder. The cops were duly involved. The chief doctor advised the detectives to give Katy 4 days to recover fully before they interrogated her. The 2 detectives had no choice but to comply with the doctor's directive. Meanwhile, the astonishing news of Katy's miraculous resurrection, like the biblical Lazarus, was making the rounds across the news platforms. David seized the opportunity, and together with his aides, he leaked to the general populace the revelation that Katy was indeed poisoned, just as he had always maintained. The revelation led to a massive outpouring of sympathy and support for David from the city folk, with almost all the eligible voters vowing to vote for him in the upcoming mayoral election. There was no doubt whatsoever that David was coasting home to a landslide win on election day. After the 4 days had elapsed, the detectives then interrogated Katy, and that was when she made a really shocking revelation. A revelation that came like an unexpected hurricane, and that still surely stuns many of the city folk to this very day. When the cops asked Katy if she recalled the last thing she ate before she blacked out, she replied that she did. According to Katy's story, it was actually their 6th wedding anniversary, and David had prepared and served her favorite breakfast in bed with a tall glass of her favorite grape juice. Katy claimed that David had knelt down and profusely apologized to her for an issue they were having before, and she happily accepted the meal and drank from him. Katy further revealed that she had finished the meal and juice to David's obvious delight. He had then hugged her tightly and professed his undying love for her, after which she had quickly prepared for work and left the house for the office. That was the very last thing she remembered. After Katy's incredible revelation, the 2 detectives stared at each other for a while in absolute bewilderment. Then they asked Katy if she remembered what the issue she was having with David was about. Katy then opened up about her suspicion over David having an affair with his female chief aide and campaign manager, a 23-year-old stunningly beautiful girl named Angela. It happened that about a month earlier, she was sitting on her matrimonial bed watching TV one night when David's phone, which was lying on the bed, beeped with an incoming text. David, who according to Katy had been acting quite suspiciously before then, literally went everywhere with his phone. But that particular night, he had stomach issues and was with her in the room when nature's call to desperately use the toilet arose. That was the sole reason he had forgotten to take his phone with him. Katy had instinctively picked up the phone and read the text, and to her utter dismay, the text was a love message from Angela, reminding David how much she missed and loved him. Katy was close to tears as she told the detectives that she had been so hurt and heartbroken that she madly confronted David about the text when he came back into the room. The couple had a heated argument over the issue, as David firmly maintained that it was Angela who was after him, and not the other way around. He even claimed to Katy that Angela had done everything possible to seduce him, but that he had been rejecting her advances all this while. Katy didn't believe David one bit, as he had been displaying all the telltale signs of cheating prior to that day. So she threatened to institute divorce proceedings against him if she discovered, after her personal investigations, that he was actually having an affair with Angela. Katy then concluded her long revelations by telling the detectives that it was barely a week after the heated argument that David had prepared her the wedding anniversary meal as part of his apologies. With much to think about, the 2 detectives thanked Katy for her cooperation and left. After Katy's shocking revelations, it was clear to even a toddler that David was responsible for poisoning her. So the cops promptly went in search of David at his home, but David was nowhere to be found. The cops also went in search of Angela as a potential accessory to attempted murder, but just like her boss, it seemed that Angela had suddenly disappeared into thin air. The city's police department extended their dragnets for the 2 suspects and raised the tempo of the search. 3 days later, the cops' efforts finally bore fruit as David and Angela were intercepted on a lonely highway by an eagle-eyed patrol team as they were trying to slip out of the city in the middle of the night. The 2 were arrested at once and brought in for interrogation. After a lengthy period of trying to play smart with his interrogators, David finally broke under the mounting pressure and confessed that he had been having an affair with Angela since she started working as his aide, and that the two of them had planned to poison Katy to death out of fear that she would go ahead with her divorce threats, which would, of course, expose him as an adulterer and ruin his chances of winning the upcoming election. The duo had reasoned that poisoning Katy and pinning the murder on his political opponents would also surely win him the sympathies of the city folk, which would only be good for his campaign. According to Angela's own confessions, David had been totally obsessed with her from the very first day she came to his office for an interview. She also revealed that they had gone into hiding in an abandoned warehouse when David learned that the detectives would soon interrogate Katy, and they had planned to escape over the border to Mexico on the night they were apprehended. The detectives allowed David to call Katy and beg for her forgiveness before they took him into custody. Katy said nothing throughout the call. She only cried her eyes out. David and Angela were arraigned for first-degree attempted murder and were both sentenced to life imprisonment. That was how David went from the most popular candidate to win the upcoming mayoral elections to the most popular prisoner in the city. If you're in Katy's shoes and learned about this betrayal, what would you have done? Feel free to share your comments with us in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.